very early, well, this was actually one from the 1860s, but it sort of indicates the kind of thing that went on here. He went to the Emancipation Celebration in Augusta, Georgia. So this is after the Civil War when the South did participate in these things. And he heard a gentleman named Henry McNeil Turner, who was at that time a very prominent preacher and later a bishop in the AME Church. And he said about Turner, he spoke for 2 hours. I was so impressed with the pictures and the history and the feats and the facts that he presented of the race in past ages and of the men of the present, that my life is largely what it is today because of the impressions made at this meeting. Now, I mean, that's one example, but it is suggestive of the kind of power that these historical orations had in reaching people and letting them know that they had a proud history, which was largely denied in the broader society. But they got that kind of information. They had a proud history, and there was a proud present as well. There were leaders there who were articulate and spoke with authority, and that were telling them, here's how you can become politically engaged. So beyond congregating and educating, agitating, trying to draw people into that political cause, the abolitionist movement, and they had a large degree of success. So bringing people from all around, I just want to suggest some of the regional orientation, and I really want to encourage you all to continue with the work that's been, well, you've been doing it all in your local communities for a long time in many cases, but now that you're coming together in a larger group and sort of comparing notes, to continue with this effort to build regional ties and work together regionally for political action and social advancement. I think that's one of the most important things about what's going on here this weekend. So I want to encourage you to do that. I'm going to put this back up just to suggest a little bit of what goes on at these celebrations. And part of the reason that so many people came in the 1850s, you know, if you're telling people that, oh, come on out and you're going to hear Frederick Douglass give a 2-hour oration, and then there's going to be some sermons at the church, and it'll be great. And, you know, maybe some people would come out for that, but the folks who were organizing these were pretty smart, and they knew that they would have to offer sort of a broader range of activities to attract the largest possible audience. So in addition to the lectures and the parade, everybody loves a parade, right? And that was a fun event in itself. There would be lots of recreational activities and leisure activities. And the barbecues that we've heard talked about today, these traditions go way back way back before the Civil War. Barbecues and parading and going out to these groves. And the text here in this flyer talks about this event taking place at a place called the Haddington Mansion, which was outside of Philadelphia. You can get there on one of the rail lines that was beginning, you know, the railroads were just kind of starting to get going in the 1840s and 50s. You take a train, passenger train from Philadelphia into the countryside where this mansion was. It says, this new romantic and delightful place of resort is situated in the 24th Ward at the terminus of the passenger railway. It's enclosed by oak woods, finely cultivated farms. The surrounding country is hilly, beautiful, and picturesque. Several miniature cataracts flowing wine along. Where it says that it's taking place on Monday, August 9th. Okay? Now this doesn't have anything to do with the August 8th tradition here. What happened in this case was that August 1st fell on a Sunday, and it was deemed inappropriate to have this kind of celebration on the Sabbath. So they were originally scheduling to have it on August 2nd, but there was a huge downpour of rain, so they canceled it, and it was scheduled for the following Monday, and it was actually held on August 9th. So the date that things were celebrated, sometimes you have to sort of really dig to figure out why they were doing a certain thing. But this was an August 1st celebration, and just because of those circumstances, it ended up being held on a different day. Let me jump ahead now to the Civil War era and the time period of emancipation. And what I want to emphasize here is a couple of different things. What happens during the Civil War era, the 1860s, is, number one, you have this huge expansion of emancipation celebrations, most significantly into the South. For the first time, after the Civil War ends, in particular, you have emancipation celebrations in the southern states. And also this time, of course, it's celebrating American emancipation, American freedom, not the act of the British government that we just hoped would have some effect here. This was the real thing. So the southern states, and keep in mind, in the 1860s, and really up to about 1910, 90% of African Americans lived in the states of the former Confederacy. So when we're talking about these northern celebrations before the Civil War, there were several 100,000 free blacks in the North in 1830. There were about 400,000 or 500,000 by the time of 1860, but still 3.5 million or more were in the South. Many of them free, but the vast majority were enslaved. Celebrations of emancipation simply were not possible, or there was no reason for it there. But after freedom does come with the Civil War, emancipation throughout the South. Another thing that happens is this multiplicity of dates on which to celebrate. Whereas it was pretty unified, there are a few dissenting voices, it was pretty unified about celebrating August 1st before the Civil War. That had real significance for those folks in the North. But after the Civil War, even during it, a whole bunch of different dates came into existence, like August 8th. This image here, which I like so much because I like it so much I use it for the cover of my book, is from Washington, D.C., which was also mentioned here as celebrating in April. This is actually from 1866, and blacks in Washington, D.C. celebrated on April 16th. Anybody know why? Talk about this somewhere. It was on April, as some people know, Congress has jurisdiction of making laws for the city of Washington, D.C. In 1862, so before the Emancipation Proclamation, April 16, 1862, Congress passed a law outlawing slavery in the District of Columbia. And that was celebrated very consistently in Washington, D.C. throughout the late 19th century and into the early 20th. Really, they're still having those April 16th celebrations today in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure if it was a continuous tradition, but I know that they are doing it again today. I like this image because it shows not only the size of some of these celebrations, thousands of people coming together, but also shows, and this may not show up very well from where you're sitting, the variety of people. We have some individuals down here, African-American individuals for the most part. This one dressed with the striped pants and a long coat and top hat, very elegantly dressed man with a cane, and women with full, the hoop skirts and gowns and parasols. These are the elite, the upper crust of black society. And over here you have people dressed much more roughly with open collared shirts and rough hats, and the working classes. A woman over here with an apron and a bandana. And I'm talking children and dogs running. The whole breadth of African American society in Washington participated in these events. It was the lower classes, the uneducated, the upper classes, etc. Very important event. You have this huge parade with flags flying. This is the reviewing stand. In D.C., the President of the United States would review the parade as it passed by. So these are very important events in the nation's capital, certainly maybe distinctive because of the location of the president there. But these kind of things were happening all over the place. In terms of different dates, I'm going to put up an image here, and this is interesting. I don't know if the right way. This is the first photograph that I have found, the earliest photograph that I have found showing the Emancipation Celebration. This is from 1870. And it is a celebration that is not specifically celebrating the abolition of slavery. It is celebrating the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, which was the amendment that basically gave black men the right to vote, or at least made it so that you couldn't deny someone the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. To many people, emancipation is great, but until we are full citizens with the right to vote, then emancipation is limited. Until African Americans have that ability to control the government through their voting, then there are severe limits to what they could do as citizens. The 15th Amendment supposedly decided that question. At least on paper, African Americans were not to be denied the right to vote. This celebration in May of 1870, that was the year that the 15th Amendment was ratified. So it took place in May, a couple months after the ratification. Supposed to be 20,000 people participated in this celebration. And it's kind of hard to estimate the crowd. Maybe some statistician could look at this and estimate the number of people. This is in Monument Square, where the public addresses were to be given. And you can see clearly thousands of people congregated around that monument. And I'll point out in the background here, right here next to my finger, is the speaker's platform. Some of you might be able to see the little arch above the speaker's platform. It was erected there. Frederick Douglass was at this, as well as some U.S. government officials, white government officials, who were the speakers of the day. An interesting story about this one from newspaper accounts is, as about 20 people climbed onto the platform, onto the dais there, the speakers of the day, it collapsed. And there was a great hush in the crowd and great concern. And Douglass, supposedly after assuring himself that everyone was okay, climbed on top of the wreckage and called for 3 cheers for the 15th Amendment. And the crowd cheered, and they ended up relocating the speakers to a balcony of a nearby hotel, which I'm thinking might be visible over here. I'm not sure if that's a building or not. And they continued with the orations. But 20,000 people participating in this celebration. So the 15th Amendment raised questions. Well, do we celebrate the abolition of slavery, and on what date? Or do we celebrate the 15th Amendment, which really, in some people's mind, made freedom a reality? And what date do you celebrate that on? It was ratified on March 30th, 1870. So there were different debates about what to celebrate and when. April 16th in Washington, D.C. Let me just leave that up there while I talk. Yeah.
Can you just say what city that's in? Is that DC?
Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Washington, D.C. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That was the other one. This is Baltimore. Baltimore, Maryland. I'm sorry. Yeah. Baltimore's Washington, Monument Square. Baltimore had a very large black population in the 19th century and a very large free black population even before the Civil War, even though it was a slave state. There were many, many free blacks in Baltimore. Probably about half of the black population of Baltimore was free even before the Civil War. Let me move on here and talk about some of these dates. Okay, so we've got April 16th. We've heard a bit in terms of I'll pronounce it wrong again, Gallipolis, Ohio, celebrating in September 22nd. That was the date in 1862 when Lincoln issued his preliminary proclamation, which was basically a threat. He said, if the states that are in rebellion don't surrender and rejoin the Union by January 1st, then I'm going to abolish slavery in those states. So some people started to celebrate after 1863, started to celebrate on September 22nd. Of course, the proclamation went into effect in 1863 on January 1st. So in some areas, many areas, people started to celebrate on January 1st. However, and this came out in some conversations earlier too. I can't remember exactly who said what, but the idea, it was Alexander, I think, this morning, that this was basically an unenforceable threat. Lincoln declared slaves in these Confederate areas free, but how could he really enforce that? Well, slaves found out about it and spread the word, and they ran away from plantations in large numbers, but it didn't really end slavery in those areas. So African Americans in many areas didn't really celebrate emancipation until emancipation came to them in their region. And we've heard this over and over again. Why do you celebrate on that date? Well, that's the date we heard that we were free. That's the date the slaves were freed. Whether it's August 8th in this region, or whether it is, again, Mr. Williams mentioned Thomaston, Georgia, celebrating in late May, or whether it's Juneteenth in Texas, That was the date that had meaning in that place in terms of the reality of freedom. A couple more examples. In Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia, African Americans began celebrating on April 3rd, because that was the day that Union troops in 1865 occupied the city of Richmond, the Confederate capital, and again, really making freedom a reality for folks there. African Americans in other parts of Virginia celebrated on April 9th, which they called Surrender Day, which was the date that General Lee surrendered his army to General Grant at Appomattox. So for them, Lincoln's proclamation was sort of an empty promise until the military victory on the field made it a concrete reality. Now, the war wasn't technically over then, but that had meaning in that region that, okay, now that the army has been defeated, we can really consider ourselves to be free. So there were all these dates, and there were African American leaders throughout the late 19th century who tried to bring this together into one unified tradition. Many African Americans in the North wanted to continue celebrating August 1st. There's a lot of theories about why. Partly tradition has a deep hold. They've been celebrating this date for decades. So there's a desire to continue with what they've always done in places like New York and Ohio. And in fact, while we're talking about that, I can put up an image from the 1880s. This is an image from Elmira, New York, which is in the southern tier of the New York State counties, showing an Emancipation Celebration in the 1880s. It's a stereoscopic image, so you have like the two images on either side. You're supposed to put it in this viewer to get the 3D effect. But it doesn't show up here because of the scale, but you have a couple of the chief marshals on horseback, and you have a line of people, not a huge throng like you saw in Baltimore. But remember, this is Elmira, New York. There are probably only a few hundred black residents there in the 1880s, people coming from miles around. It's a line, there's clearly, I can see people all the way back to here, almost to the vanishing point of the horizon. Clearly several hundred people in the parade, and there's people lining the sidewalks on both sides. So there's a good turnout here in a small northern town in the 1880s. They maintain an August 1st tradition in upstate New York and other parts of the region there. So tradition has a deep hold, and also you have to think about what they like to do. Having a parade, having a big pig roast, having these outdoor events, it's kind of hard to do on January 1st in central New York. Okay? So some very practical sorts of things come into play there. Similarly, in Kansas, you saw people celebrating in August and sometimes in September. And in Ohio, as historians pointed out, celebrating in September. I know in Michigan, where I come from, August 1st was widely celebrated there after the Civil War. So there was no real consensus about when to celebrate. And there came to be increasing debates about if to celebrate, whether to celebrate. And again, I have to concur, this fits nicely with what Daniel Williams was talking about in presenting his photographs. After the turn of the 20th century, you do see a decline in these celebrations. A decline in these celebrations in most parts of the country. It didn't disappear by any means, but they seem to be less, they seem to be smaller in many cases, less public, and fewer and farther between. And I think some of the reasons behind this have to do with the Great Migration. As African Americans in large numbers after 1910 especially leave their communities in the South and go into the urban centers of the North, primarily in the Midwest, Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Detroit, New York, the community basis of these celebrations is disrupted. And there are all these people who celebrate different dates, and there are other things that go on too. Part of what I argue is that the functions that these celebrations served in the 1800s, educating, political activism, they were being fulfilled by other kinds of organizations. So by the early 20th century, you have the NAACP in terms of political activism. You have things at the turn of the century like the Afro-American League, which was formed and relatively short-lived, the Niagara movement that W.E. Du Bois formed that sort of grew into the NAACP. There are other avenues for that kind of political activism. As far as sort of social self-help kinds of things, you have things like the Urban League developing and settlement house movements for African American people and other kinds of self-help organizations. In terms of education, we begin to have some pretty good, especially in the cities, some pretty good African American school systems developing, or at least the isolated schools. Washington, D.C. had an incredible African American school system, segregated school system that taught black history in the schools. And there were increasing numbers of African Americans writing the history of black people in the United States, beginning in the 1880s and into the early 20th century, more and more published material that found its way into some of these African American classrooms and into the home libraries of the reading public. Literacy rates were increasing, so that more people who could have access to these. African American newspapers were expanding in number, so they had more, and history was presented there. So some of those educational functions of the celebrations were kind of obsolete by the early 20th century. And some of the entertainment value in these celebrations by the early 20th century started to sort of pale in comparison to some of the mass entertainments that were then available, especially in the cities where more and more people were coming. And they weren't just moving from the south to the north, into Chicago and Cleveland and those places. Blacks would go from the rural south into the urban south. Folks from the Georgia countryside going into Atlanta, and probably similar things happening in Tennessee with folks coming into Memphis or Nashville or other larger centers to find work opportunities that didn't exist for them in the countryside. So you see, in these growing cities, you have things like dance halls and Nickelodeons and other kinds of entertainment that make the Emancipation Celebration seem kind of quaint by comparison and not as enticing, not as attractive to go to. And finally, as far as a big reason why I think that these celebrations declined somewhat by the early 20th century is when you think about it, there wasn't a heck of a lot to celebrate by that time. Especially after the 1890s, those paper promises of the Reconstruction period about citizenship and equal protection under the law and voting rights were paper promises only. They didn't have any real relevance in the lives of people, with lynching increasing year by year through the 1890s and into the early 20th century, with disfranchisement and the removal of the right to vote widespread, particularly in the southern states, not so much in the north, but particularly in the south. Equal protection under the law was a cruel joke for African Americans in the early 20th century. So many actually argued in some newspaper articles, and there's some evidence for this, why are we celebrating this freedom that doesn't really exist for us? What we need to do is get out there on the battlefronts and start working to achieve freedom instead of having these empty kind of celebrations, celebrating a freedom that doesn't really exist for us. So for all these reasons, I do see them feeding into this decline of the celebrations by the early 20th century. But they didn't die out. And some of what we've heard today, people sharing their own experiences and stories from older folks in their communities, that they did survive. And I think it was Bill who mentioned the pattern that he's noticed a lot of times in smaller towns, is where in the South. There are certain exceptions. The Gallipolis, Ohio. There are certain northern communities that maintain these traditions as well. But smaller towns in the South, I think, is where these traditions somehow were deeply rooted enough to be maintained over the years. And sometimes there were gaps. As with Juneteenth in the middle part of the 20th century, sort of dying out, it starts to get revived by the 1960s and 70s and becomes eventually an official state holiday in Texas by the 1980s. And there's a movement to make it a national holiday today, which is interesting in a lot of different ways. Again, there's that issue of, well, what about these other dates? What about January 1st? What about August 8th, whose tradition goes deepest? Which date should we honor? I want to close here and you want to have an opportunity to ask questions and maybe make some comments and then have some discussion before we move on to the next set of activities. But one thing I want to point out here is a very little known fact, that in fact there is a holiday, an official national holiday, commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. It's called National Freedom Day. And it's originated in Philadelphia by a gentleman named Richard Robert Wright, not the novelist Richard Wright, This was a gentleman who was born a slave in Georgia, became a prominent banker and educator and newspaper publisher, moved to Philadelphia. His son, Richard Robert Wright Jr., was a bishop of the AME Church in the mid-20th century. But Richard Robert Wright Sr., who was born in the 1850s, by the 1940s was pushing for this national holiday, and he got the date February 1st. It was actually not until 2 years after he died that it became official. His children carried on his work. And President Harry Truman, in 1948, signed a bill that designated February 1st as National Freedom Day, celebrating the end of slavery. And the significance of that date, okay, yet another date, right? The significance of that date is not, no, it's not the first day in Black History Month, although we can make that connection now. It was the date in 1865 when Abraham Lincoln signed the congressional resolution that would become the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment of the Constitution is what officially ended slavery in the United States. And Lincoln signed that document on February 1st, 1865. And then, of course, it had to go through the process of being ratified by the states. That didn't end up being completed until December of 1865. But the focus here on the 13th Amendment, February 1st is National Freedom Day. If you, so there is an official holiday. And a question remains, well, why not celebrate that? It's on the books already. And I have some theories about that, too, and some theories about why Juneteenth, for example, has generated a lot of interest, and I'll just share that with you as a final thought. January 1st, Emancipation Proclamation is a declaration by some white guy saying the slaves are free. February 1st, same kind of thing. The white government of the United States says the slaves are free. Juneteenth, in a way, represents, this idea of, okay, Lincoln declared this to be in effect on February 1st, 1865. He signed that resolution for the 13th Amendment, but it wasn't until June of 1865 that slaves in Texas actually got to experience freedom because the Union Army finally arrived there and enforced it. It's that delay that I think is really significant. It's sort of symbolic of the continual delays in racial justice in this country. This is just a theory here, but I think there's some resonance there that the acts of a white government are significant in their own way, but the reality of freedom and the having to wait for freedom and the constantly being denied freedom and justice is one reason that I think Juneteenth it sort of grabs people. That 2.5-year wait after the Emancipation Proclamation before it became real, that is sort of symbolized in the continual waiting for justice, waiting, as Martin Luther King said in his famous letter from Birmingham jail, to people who have not, paraphrasing very roughly here, who have not experienced justice, it's easy to say wait, but too often wait for African Americans has meant never. And it's that kind of meaning that I think Juneteenth brings about. Maybe there are other theories on that. That's just some thoughts off the top of my head. I've thrown a lot of it at you. I thank you for sitting through a history lecture this afternoon after a long day of hearing lots of interesting things. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions you have or any comments that anybody has. Yes?
Just to follow up on your last piece. So are there any communities that celebrate February 1st in your research? I mean, it's still celebrated in Philadelphia? It is?
Yeah, and pretty much in very few other places. Actually, South Carolina has had celebrations where the governor has made a proclamation several years in a row declaring February 1st National Freedom Day to be celebrated in the state. And that might be because Richard Robert Wright, the founder, taught, actually one of the founders and the first president of what is now South Carolina State College. It would have a different name back then, I forget what it was. But mainly in Philadelphia, there is still the National Freedom Day Association in Philadelphia that is has consistently stayed in the Wright family. His son, and then now I believe it's his granddaughter, who is at the forefront of that organization. So it's primarily in Philadelphia. That's yes.
Mitch, information, and then I guess two questions. Great interest to see your map of upstate New York in the Tennessee Valley, and we spent about 8 years up there prior to coming here. And having lived in a place and worked at Moncton, which you may be familiar with, which is just over from, well, anyway, it's near Canandaigua and that whole thing. African-American community there came out of Culpeper, Virginia. They came there because a Union Army officer bought land up there, which is rich wheat country. A lot of people don't think growing wheat in upstate New York. And went back to Culpeper and offered them free land because the valley was, Virginia was pretty much wiped out after the war. That, breadbasket. So they resettled there and formed a community, and the mother church of many of the African-American churches in Rochester is in Moncton. They had a church homecoming, which was known as Emancipation Day, which was August 1st. That is a lead up to the question. In all the discussions today, I've heard no mention made of the role of the established church in these celebrations. You can almost get the feeling that these whole things were sort of like a Mickey Rooney story. Oh, let's have a play.
Right.
Oh, let's have a celebration. But there had to be, in my mind, some centering point, some synergism. And in the case up there, the church was the centering point. Where does the church fit in this?
It's
And
very.
then I have a follow-up question.
Okay, it is very central in many areas. What I found in my research in the 19th century is that you have a relatively small group of relatively well-educated people and people who had some financial resources, sort of the stable middle class, if you will, of the antebellum free black communities in these northern communities. And you have ministers and their churches and congregations. You have journalists, and you have people who are sort of full-time, and these are a very small number of people, full-time political agitators, people like Frederick Douglass, Henry Highland Garnett, who was also a minister, by the way, Martin Delaney, Charles B. Ray. Many of these people are ministers, and it's not a coincidence that ministers were recognized community leaders. Their voice in the community was extremely influential, and they were central to organizing these events. And the role that particular congregations played was very often, and I didn't talk about gendered kinds of issues in these celebrations. Women played an extremely important role in these celebrations, not so much by marching at the front of the parade or speaking on the platforms, although that happened. Very, very rarely did women give the big orations. They would maybe get on stage and read a poem or something like that. But fundraising. These celebrations wouldn't take place without. Ring a bell? Fundraising. These women organized fairs and did sewing and soul thing and preparing the food. You hear about all these feasts and things. Who made the food? And you see occasional references in the newspaper articles to the role that the women played. And these behind it. So it's church congregations, or sometimes affiliate organizations like the Daughters of Ruth, which is an affiliate of the Odd Fellows, or other kinds of women's organizations, sometimes separate from the church, sometimes part of the church, that were essential to making these things happen, doing the dirty behind-the-scenes work that somebody's got to do. While the mail orders get all the glory, but and they did acknowledge in many cases the women. And you had another question?
Yes, thank you.
This stuff wasn't happening in the South. Maybe in a sort of isolated pocket here and there, and it was very clandestine, if it took place at all. But after U.S. emancipation, by the late 1860s, the war is over, and in many areas of the South, with the assistance of the federal military presence, African Americans celebrated exuberantly. and in a widespread way. And just a couple of images. I'll put a couple of images up here. I don't think we have to dim the lights to sort of make a couple of the points I wanted to make. But the military presence in the United States, of the United States troops. This is an image that was printed in a, it's not a photograph, it's a really bad drawing. I'm not sure if it shows it very well. And there's a lot of things you can analyze in the image. And some of the sort of minstrel show denigrating stereotypes of the way African American people supposedly look. And white artists were notorious for creating these really distorted and denigrating images. You can see a little of that here. There's lots worse than I could show you. But what I want to point out here is this is from supposedly depicting a celebration in 1863, January 1st, 1863 in South Carolina, where the Union forces had occupied in the Sea Island area there along the coast. With African American military forces. Of course, the black military presence is a big part of what comes into play. Or actually, this is 1864, the first celebration after the first year anniversary after emancipation. So you see African American military personnel, a couple on the stage holding flags in the crowd, but everybody else on the stage is white. And it's the white military presence that allows this to take place. And they really tried to control the black celebrations in the South, because when the slaves were freed, they wanted to celebrate, as I said, very exuberantly. And the white power structure wasn't very enthusiastic about letting them celebrate in the manner that they wanted to. So there was an issue of control. But African Americans did celebrate widely in the South. This is an image from the 1870s, from 1876 in Charleston, South Carolina, that was in an illustrated newspaper from the time period. There's a couple of, that building at the top, this is the CEDnet. This is the main square in Charleston where public celebrations took place, official public celebrations. But African Americans in 1876 to have taken over this site, that claim of public space, an incredibly important political statement that they are citizens, they're controlling this public space, the most important public space, arguably, in Charleston in the 1870s. With military personnel, with marching bands, and here you have a wagon being pulled with women dressed in gowns with crowns and waving American flags with the speaker's platform. A big crowd here. You have a marching band being led, a black fire company participating in the parade. Here's a close-up of some of the people who were involved in the parade. Military men getting in their garb. This is from the same 1876 Charleston celebration. I've actually got it up backwards, but it conveys the idea here. What's interesting here, though, is we talk about change over time in these things. As many people are aware, the Reconstruction period during which African Americans had some opportunity to exercise citizenship rights, voting rights, to hold political office in significant numbers in a lot of southern communities and states. By 1877, Reconstruction was over. It was a gradual process of these, basically the same white slaveholders who were in charge before the Civil War were back in charge again. Sometimes as early as 1870 in some places, not in South Carolina, not really totally until 1876. This is probably the last occasion on which African Americans could claim the right to use that space in the Citadel as American citizens. They were probably, I don't have evidence of this, I haven't really tracked it, but my sense is that they were largely excluded from being able to have this kind of celebration and taking over the town, as it were, after the 1870s. So this kind of image wouldn't have taken place a few years later. But celebrations do continue. White Americans in the South largely, I guess, tolerated African Americans celebrating emancipation in the late 19th century as long as they didn't get out of line, okay? As long as you didn't have an orator standing up there and calling for the end of disenfranchisement and claiming full citizenship rights and making a sort of radical political argument that we need to rise up and fight for our rights. You hear that kind of thing and these things are snuffed out. So in a lot of the orations, now some historians argue with me about that. There's a historian at the University of North Carolina named Fitzhugh Brundage, very eminent scholar, who argues that blacks in the South actually could and did make pretty strong political statements at some of these Southern celebrations in the late 19th, early 20th century. I'm not saying it never happened, but the broad patterns are that the celebrations were fine as long as they, and you see lots of speeches where the orator will be up there saying, okay, we're here and we really appreciate our white brothers and sisters helping us. We appreciate everything that the government's doing for us when, the government was doing anything for them. So you see that kind of buckling under to the power structure in order to be able to get what you can out of it, because to butt right up against it often would lead to the destruction of your community. So African American leaders have to walk a very fine line in that turn of the century period and afterwards in terms of how far they could push. Okay? Yes, sir.
Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Bill. You go first.
Okay. You were talking about the decline, and you saw somewhat of a tapering off, I suppose you said, of celebrations as you entered the 1900s. And we're new at this, but as far as trying to uncover about the 8th of August, but it seems to me that at the beginning of the 1900s, the celebration of the 8th of August began to take off, go upwards. Now, the reason I say that is that in 1897, let's say in 1888, should I say, people from Knoxville came to Greeneville. All right, 200 people came to Greeneville in 1888. Okay, nine years later in 1897, 700 people from Knoxville came out. 500 went to Johnson City. 200 came to Greeneville. So what that means to me anyway is that in 1897, there we go, 1897, that there was not a celebration in Knoxville. Okay, by 1900, in the year 1900, 3,500 people took excursion trains to come to Knoxville.
Yeah.
Okay, now if it's true that, we're making an assumption here, if it is true that the 8th of August celebrations did start in Greeneville and began to spread, then it didn't get to Knoxville until actually 1897. And then 3 years later, there was this huge one. And then it was celebrated, it seems, from what, I know there's a little small community called Hoop Creek. Hook Creek, sorry. Anna's mom was a school teacher up in Hook Creek. That'd be better. There was only like 100 black people, and I happened to somehow know about 50. I don't quite get this. My son's best friend's dad is from Hook Creek. Anna's mom taught school there, Shadina Fortune. But anyway, that in the 30s, in the late 20s and 30s, Hook Creek, they celebrated at a grove down on a river. So it seems like, as far as the 8th is concerned, although this is all, again, just, trying to piece it together a little bit, that maybe it started swinging upward and spreading as the 1900s started. Maybe, and we don't know this, but I'm kind of wondering if it may have peaked in the 30s and 40s.
And I've seen other kinds of examples in some small towns, in mid-sized towns in Maryland, Fredericksburg, Maryland, Williamsport, Maryland, right around 1900, 1890s, very early 1900s. I see celebrations that apparently had never taken place before start to be celebrated sometime like in mid-August for no apparent reason in Maryland. I'm not sure. I didn't mention this. Maryland, when the earlier one mentioned the official abolition of slavery in Tennessee taking place in October or something. Why wasn't that celebrated? In Maryland, it actually, the state of Maryland in 1864 abolished slavery on November 4th. And they did celebrate that for a while, and a lot of people were elsewhere in the country commenting on, were really confused about what they were doing celebrating in November. But that didn't last long. But these celebrations around 1900 in some of these towns were in like early to mid-August, and couldn't really figure out why. So here's another example of some place starting celebrations, but I'm saying that they started to decline. And so what I have to emphasize here is in the research that I did, as I said, I looked from East Coast to West. I have celebrations from Key West to San Francisco to Portland, Oregon to Maine and Canada, and so I'm looking so broadly and trying to identify broad patterns here. And the broad pattern that I see is a general decline after the turn of the century. But the real important thing, and this is something else that excites me about what's going on here, what really has to be done is to look at particular communities and see what happened there. So within these broad patterns, not every community is going to follow that broad pattern. Statistically, I see a decline. But in particular areas, whether it's Maryland, the August 8th celebrations around here, you may well have a very different trajectory that doesn't fit the broad patterns that I've laid out. And this is the kind of historical work that is really, really important. People in local and regional areas looking at what happened here, because a famous person once said, all history is local history. If you really want to understand whether the arguments I put forward in my book are right or not, lots of people in Tennessee and Maryland and everywhere else are going to have to do studies and say, here's what happened here, and then we can get a much clearer picture of what's going on nationally. So what I'm trying to do in the work that I've done already is sort of providing a broad framework, and then people can do their own work and say, no, you're wrong, it's happening this way here. So yeah, there may very well be a different trajectory here.
If I could just follow that, and then Eugene really maybe answer all. But I'm just wondering if across the North, there's such a long history before the Civil War and on up to the Civil War and afterward, and then maybe it began to taper off. And if maybe one of George Collins is getting at something, there's maybe 3 strips across the country, across the North, a thin band, which is the border states, and then the deep South states, where the deep South states, it's only sporadic because the repression. I grew up in Alabama in the 50s and 60s. There wasn't a whole lot of, in the 50s, a whole lot of parades in Scottsboro, Alabama, I'll tell you that. Let's show our freedom every day, So, it makes me wonder, George, if maybe you might have something there that things across the border states began to loosen up enough, where in the deep South, it was too tight still. In the North, there was this 100-year-old history.
That's certainly a theory worth exploring. And one other point that I would make is, depends on what kind of celebration it is. A number of people were telling me today that a lot of people were just out celebrating and didn't really have a sense of the historical roots of what they were celebrating, and people knew this was when the slaves were freed, but it wasn't a politicized event. It was a sort of festive good time. We sort of congregate and socialized aspects were there, but the agitation wasn't there, and that would have been acceptable to the white dominant society. So it depends on that too. Yes, sir.
During this time, post-Reconstruction, there was a lot of reaction to construction, especially in the South, but also in the North. I've noticed birth of Jim Crow at that time, where it was getting stronger, and of course it was forced probably by Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, a lot of these celebrations could have been a reaction to the black reaction to what was going on in the country, wasn't there in the news. You saw this strong growth of the Klan, segregation, Jim Crow, all of this, and could some of these 8-month celebrations could not have been a reaction to the pendulum swinging back?
Very well may have been. Well, one thing first, as far as the 8th of August, I think the first thing to be figured out is, there is evidence here as early as 1870 of the 8th of August celebrations. And one thing that further research needs to be done in archives and newspapers, other kinds of resources, is to try to piece together just the nuts and bolts of, well, how many celebrations were there? Did they have them every year? Did they have a couple in the early 1870s and stop and then pick them up in the 1890s? So I think those kinds of questions need to be answered before you can try to talk about what caused them to take root or to expand in a particular time period. So you've got to establish the basic facts and then try to interpret what meaning can we impose on those facts. But again, in terms of being a reaction to the political repression, say of the 1890s and early 20th century, you'd have to also look at how politicized these events are. Are the orders of these events basically calling attention to those injustices, and calling for people to fight against those injustices? In which case, then what was the reaction of the white power structure to that kind of challenge? Or were the celebrations a little more, non-militant? So you have to look at what was going on at these celebrations, and then what kind of pattern there is in terms of when they started, and did they increase, did they get bigger in size, did people come from a larger area, and figure out why that's happening. So what you're saying very, very well may be the case, but it's going to take more research to figure that out.
There's only a question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's a question that needs to be answered with historical research. This gentleman here, I think, has a question.
Bill answered the first part of my question. I had Negro history in high school. You take the American history and the Negro history book, worded, pictures, boom, everything falls over there.
This is in the segregated schools?
Yes, yes, it was, they took it in 1962 when I graduated. But it tells, like you were talking about upstate New York, it tells a different story about celebration all through the South, everywhere.
Different between the
In
sort of
wording,
mainstream
and-
history
yeah.
and the, So-
About inventions, everything.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so, it's hard to believe what American history states based on what I have learned through Negro history. And, for instance, you were showing pictures up there. If you saw a Black history book, the artwork was tremendous. Celebration dates, how they celebrated in barns, not in open, down the town hall, those places. They celebrated out in the wooded area, all that. But if you go to American history, it was downtown in the city area.
In terms of African American celebration?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if there's a question in there or if that's an interesting observation.
Like for an example,
Yeah.
through 1882 through, I would say 1899, you talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, how they celebrated here in Tennessee and other areas. Black history, but didn't you take Black history in high school? In grade school. It tells a different story, right? Total different story.
A different story from
Oh, Warrior. White America wrote,
okay, yeah.
wrote American history.
Yeah, Black Americans were basically
Yeah.
written out of
Yeah.
the mainstream history books, right?
Like, for example, what happened when the Negroes, slaves came up from the South into upstate New York? What happened to the Indians? Because there were interracial marriages.
Yeah. Well, I
But
mean, from the
nobody
beginning,
says
from the
so.
beginning,
But
there was
Black
interracial
people
marriage.
do.
This is something that, from the time that you were experiencing high school history, we're working on. The high school history books, and especially the college level history books today, are much better than they were 20, 30 years ago, okay? There's still a long way to go because a lot of times there's a lot more information in textbooks today about African American history, but a lot of times it's sort of added on as something separate. And I think what really needs to be done is that the experience and the perspectives and the priorities of African and African American people need to be sort of integrated, I hesitate to use that word integrated, but integrated into the story of America in a way that hasn't been the case. So even what you see in textbooks today, it's like, here's the story of American history, and then African Americans were doing this. Okay? And that's not the way it was. African American history is essential, and I'm preaching to the choir here, right? African American history is essential to understanding American history. You can't understand American history without taking account of the experiences and priorities and the impact of African and African American people. It's been a constant thread all through this country from the beginning of colonization here to the present. You mentioned Native Americans. A place like Massachusetts, the black population and the Native American population in early Massachusetts was intermingling all the time. Lots of them, and other parts of the country as well, especially in the southeast. All kinds of intermarriages and intermingling, whether it's with the Seminoles or the Creeks or places down in Louisiana. All kinds of racial intermingling between black and Native American peoples, and that's a big part of what shaped American culture. Yeah.
That you hit on a very strong point, because that is the history of America. That is American history, and how we can deal with the origins and the history of this country and leave that out. I don't fully understand.
Yeah, it's been done for so long,
but it just ignores the reality. Absolutely. Read my own history. Narragansett, Wampanoags, African Americans, Portuguese even, Cape Verde, because in the Massachusetts Bay Area, in places like Fall River, Massachusetts, Martha's Vineyard, you have a very strong Portuguese Cape Verde Island and
this is
and why do we ignore that?
right. Right.
Mitch, could you synthesize this statement? We can't hear over you.
Basically, or do you want to synthesize it yourself?
Well, I was just piggybacking on it.
It's an age thing.
Okay, I was just saying how what he's saying, it really is the history of America, the intermingling, the mixture of Native Americans, African Americans, whites. It's just so intermingled, and to write the history. How can you write the history of the country like in American history and leave all of that out?
And as I said, we're working on that. I'm not writing a textbook myself, but things are getting better and more inclusive and taking account of some of those things. But it takes a long time for that to filter through, and especially if you get into elementary and high schools. I mean, we're working on it at the college level, and it's hard enough to get that across there. But the thing is, since the 80s, there's been all this debate about multiculturalism. What I always tell my classes when I'm talking about early America especially is, this has always been a multicultural society. This is not something new that's being imposed by politically correct people in the 1980s. I mean, that's a bunch of crap. We've always been multicultural, and it's just a matter of shaking this country to recognize that reality that is what needs to be done. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'd like to say that since I have been involved in the history of Greeneville, because I was born and raised here, I am so amazed because the black people in Greeneville, really, the 8th of August was like an explosion. It was all over the county, everywhere. And I've learned, too, that the black people were given the opportunity to have anything they wanted, as long as they didn't connect. What I mean, they couldn't go anywhere where the white man was, but they could have anything they wanted where they were. We had anything, lawyers, doctors, I would say Indian chiefs, but I don't. But we had everything here in Greeneville. We really did. And I really think the decrease came when integration came. For some reason, it put a stamp on us.
Yeah.
And we have allowed it to be that way, and we need to wake up and do something. If not, we're going to die.
Yeah, I mean, immigration, the basic rights that were starting to be recognized through that whole civil rights process are very positive in many respects. And on the other hand, and you see this in so many black communities, and I'm sure all of you, many of you know this from your own experiences and your family histories, that there were in many of these segregated communities a vibrant and strong black middle class, modeling for the younger generations, doctors and lawyers and teachers and ministers and so on. And when you have, say, integrated public schools, those wonderful, fine black teachers and administrators couldn't get a job in those school systems. And, you know, black lawyers and doctors had a harder time finding a clientele in a so-called integrated society. And so that's one of the sort of problematic downsides, I guess, of integration, that a lot of that was lost.
I collect pictures for collages that I'm planning to put in the museum. And I found a picture the other day that I believe this black family must have been celebrating, I'm thinking the 8th of August, because behind them was a building and it had the flags, you know, draped on the walls.
I'm taking it.
And I'm just wondering if they were celebrating the 8th of August at that time.
Hard to say, it'd be interesting.
I intend to ask the family. They may not know, may not have even taken any attention, but I noticed it when I was putting it away. But people really here in Greeneville, they were all that. I mean, it was like we were in another place of our own to do our own thing. From all, and the education of the black people was tremendous.
Yeah,
And for
it's
some reason,
a really sort of complex and perplexing kind of development that came with some of the advancements in immigration. I think I'm just about out of the time I'm allotted. There's one question.
Two things, statements is probably another question. One was a forum of Tavis Smiley was the state of Black America just a few months ago. And it had black leaders there and businessmen and all. And our people have a tendency to blame other folk for where we are. We've been given everything, but we haven't done anything with it. Instead, we continue to blame others. The focus of this conference is to take back what you all have talked about today and what is ours, and we have to do this. I talked to a person who maybe said something about ministers that you were talking about in your presentation, which was the backbone of the black community forever until now. And the black ministers now say that it's not popular to be so bold as Dr. White was. It's not a popular thing to do, and it's dangerous to do. But we have to come together as a people and do things. And I think the importance of this conference is not to focus particularly on a day. The day is great, but focus on the Emancipation Day. We have on our sign for 8th of August here, 8th of August, and separate Emancipation Day. So what we're focusing on is Emancipation Day. Wherever it is, just come together, and like you said, put the pieces together, and then we can focus on a date later. But right now we need to focus on Emancipation Day as a country, Black America, and let's go forward from there. And just not play games and blame other folks. Because of it, like I said, in Philadelphia, February, it was made by President Truman a national day, a freedom day. What have we done? Like the Voting Rights Amendment coming to an end soon.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't realize that. And I'm sure they play the Dickens taking away my right to vote. I'll go down for that. But it's coming up soon where if it's not made law, your right to vote can be taken away in 2005.
Well, many people would argue that many people's right to vote was taken away in 2000 and 2004. That's, if we're getting into some other questions, but we don't want to raise that one. But what you said here, I mean, calling this emancipation. When I was talking, some of the things that I saw in the early 20th century, when I see this, people sort of saying, well, what do we have to celebrate? A lot of the folks are saying, okay, emancipation from slavery is fine. We can celebrate that. We can acknowledge that. That happened 50 years ago in the 1860s, and slavery is no longer a legal condition in the United States. But what we need now, this is like in the 1910s, what we need now is economic emancipation.
I'd like to thank the African American Task Force of CEDnet for inviting me to this occasion. And I'd also like to congratulate the task force on its boldness. The date, August the 8th, points directly at Andrew Johnson and in today's scholarly environment. That's a name of business indeed. Johnson, to me, has become the scapegoat for the failure of the racial settlement of Reconstruction. And scholars tend to hold on to their scapegoats like a mine of gold. I first became aware of Johnson's role in the 8th of August celebration by listening to a lecture from Robert Booker, former director of the Beckett Center in Knoxville, and by reading his book, 200 Years of Black Culture in Knoxville, Tennessee. I later found there was an oral tradition in Greene County to the same effect. And the work of the task force has uncovered a number of articles that support this. One from the Knoxville Journal of August the 8th, 1939, quote, a black officer in the federal court in Knoxville, Eric Hansen, quote, the Tennessee Negroes selected August the 8th because on that day, former President Andrew Johnson of Greeneville emancipated his few personal slaves. It seemed a better date than the others because it makes an outdoor celebration possible. There was another article found in the Knoxville Sentinel in 1904 that says that 1904 is the 39th anniversary of the celebration, which means August the 8th, 1865. Now let's assume for the purpose of discussion that both of these are correct. August the 8th, 1865 was before the 13th Amendment was ratified, and thus slavery was still legal in the United States of America. Specifically, it was still legal in Kentucky, Delaware, and West Virginia. So, the emancipation date of August the 8th, the date chosen for the festival, was chosen to symbolize the promise of emancipation, not the complete realization of emancipation. And of course, that would be true anyway, because on August the 8th, all Johnson had done was free his personal slaves. And I think either an implicit or maybe an explicit promise was given to his slaves that this is just the beginning. I'll elaborate on that in a second. But it was just the beginning, and he fulfilled the promise. Andrew Johnson freed the slaves of Tennessee in a proclamation in October '64, and he was the leader of the Constitutional Convention in February 1865, in which the Tennessee Constitution was rewritten, including a clause outlaw slavery forever. So let me review some of the influences of Greene County, East Tennessee that brought Johnson to this life position. He came from the Deep South. He originally was from North Carolina. He moved to South Carolina. He lived in Alabama. He came to Greene County as a teenager in 1826. In 1826, free blacks voted in Tennessee. African Americans attended the colleges of East Tennessee. This is particularly true of American College, which had black graduates and black students all through the 19th century until it was outlawed by the Tennessee State Legislature in the early 20th century. Greeneville College had at least one black student, John Gloucester, who had originally been a student at American College. Greeneville College also had Native American students, so it was open to various races. The intellectual leaders of East Tennessee were enlightened on this issue. Hezekiah Balch, Charles Coffin, Dr. Samuel Hill, all were emancipationists. I've recently come across a book of lectures of Sam Lowe. They're really epitomes of his lectures. After he had retired, his family black slaves escaped across the frozen river with a daughter, and that is her novel, Promise of Emancipation. There were also other influences. There was a newspaper published in Greeneville in the 1820s, The Genius of Universal Emancipation, and Johnson used that phrase, the Genius of Universal Emancipation. So you can see the East Tennessee emancipation movement had its effect on Andrew Johnson. Now, I've concentrated on the good influences, and I think they should be honored and recognized. I'm not trying to say that there were no bad influences. But the good influences were there, they were powerful, and they affected Johnson's outlook. When he was first elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives in 1835, the following year, 1836, he spoke and worked against the proposed law to ban abolitionist literature from the mail. He failed the law became the bill became law, but he worked against it. In 1838, he submitted a petition to the state legislature to allow two of his constituents to free two of their slaves. They would then marry and remain in East Tennessee. This had to be done by petition because by Tennessee law at the time, if a slave were free, the slave would have to leave the state. So in 1838, he submits a petition that is opposed to the colonization of the movement. In the early 1840s, Johnson became a slaveholder when he bought Dolly and Sam. Dolly's son, William Andrew Johnson, gave an interview in 1937 describing the circumstances. Quote, "My mother was a good-looking woman. Her owner sold her at a big auction in Greeneville, Tennessee. She looked around the crowd of buyers before the auction started, and she saw Andrew Johnson and liked his looks. So she went up to him and asked him if he wouldn't buy her. He bid her in for $500, and he bought my uncle, her brother, for $540. Her brother, of course, was Sam, who became Sam Johnson, and the relationship of Andrew Johnson and Sam Johnson became very close. I think by knowing Dolly and Sam, Johnson was pulled back again from this racist worldview that was lingering in him from his years in the Deep South. There is evidence of this racism in Johnson, but it's in the early years, and it fades away as he develops. One of the worst of his racist references, was in a speech in 1844. He was a freshman congressman in Washington, and he made a speech to the U.S. Congress in favor of the gag resolution, which was a resolution that the Congress would no longer accept abolitionist petition. He said that black people shouldn't be allowed to vote because they didn't have the talent to vote, even when so far as the characters were African physiology. It's really horrible reading, and it's the very stuff that the anti-Johnson scholars emphasize. However, Johnson was moving, his intellectual outlook was changing, and even in this 1844 speech, he makes a reference to emancipation as the goal of American politics. It's a fairly obscure reference, and let me read it for you, and you'll see what I mean. You got to remember now, he was a freshman congressman from a slave state, so he was walking on eggs, so to speak. He made the following reference in referring to John Quincy. In a speech made by the gentleman from Massachusetts, a short time ago, he says he thinks the consummation of Christian religion will not take place until emancipation of the Negroes is effected. And then I suppose we will have the commencement of that glorious millennium which has been so long prophesied. I wish that day would come, he said, but I do not wish to attain it by means of bloodshed and the sacrifice of thousands of lives. So I wish that day would come as a direct reference to emancipation. Congressman Johnson made a more direct endorsement of emancipation in an 1845 speech on Texas annexation. He said to Congress that they should annex the Texas territory because of, quote, the profitable employment it would give to slave labor, thereby enabling the masters to clothe and feed that portion of our population, softening and alleviating their condition, and in the end, when it shall please him who works out all great events by general laws, prove to be the gateway out of which the sable sons of Africa are to pass from bondage to freedom. So these references are mild, regarded, but they are direct references to emancipation governor because of his anti-slavery opinions and the large vote that it brought in East Tennessee. Johnson was called by his opponent during this time an abolitionist in disguise, and he was praised at abolitionist meetings in the North. While he was governor, there wasn't much he could do because it was illegal by the 1835 Constitution for the state legislature to free slaves without the consent of the slaveholder. And so there was not much he could do. But one thing he could do, he did, and that is raise funds to help any slave that wanted to immigrate to Liberia, which he did do. As U.S. Senator, he avoided a direct debate on the slavery issue because he felt it was divisive and wouldn't go anywhere. But he did stand for the territorial, let's see what it's called, the Homestead Bill. And the Homestead Bill was a bill to allow large farms to be settled by free labor, and it didn't specify free labor, but the farms were such that you would expect that free labor would settle the farm. And then they would own the land without even paying for it. And it was hoped that this would populate the Western territories with free labor, who would then come in as free states, and enough free states could pass the constitutional amendment. This became the basis of the Free Soil Party, and Johnson supported the Free Soil Party, although he never joined it. The Free Soil Party eventually became part of the Republican Party, whose program was to end slavery in the territories. During the years before the Civil War, Sam Johnson and Andrew Johnson became, in effect, friends rather than master and slave. Sam soon achieved a de facto freedom, and there's a nice word portrait of him by Andrew Johnson's son, Charles. There's a little bit of slang in here, but I think we'll probably live with that because it shows Sam Johnson with his fierce determination to be a free man, and it shows his character. This is Charles Johnson writing to his father, Andrew Johnson, in 1860. A few days since, Mother, that's Eliza McCarty Johnson, Mother sent him, Sam, word to cut wood at the Pattersons. He came up to the house and said he would be damned if he wanted to cut wood. And if you wanted to sell him, you could just do so just as soon as you please. He did not care a damn. Charles continued. You will see he is quite an independent gentleman, and just to show his notion of himself and his rights. At another time, he was asking Mother for part of some money to pay him for work. Mother remarked to him, if he was as ready to pay others as he was to collect, he would be better. He replied that he did not get enough know-how, but he also had all that he could make. So that gives you some idea of the independence and bravery, really, of Sam Johnson. And I think it also shows that he was confident in his relationship with Andrew Johnson. He had become, in effect, a free man, although not officially free, and a friend. As the Civil War approached and the Confederacy began to take form, Johnson believed that if they could keep the war from happening, that the free white laborers of the South would eventually end slavery without a vote. He wrote to Sam Milligan, his friend in Greeneville, about the secessionist movement. It is not the free men of the North they are fearing votes, the secessionists did, but the free men of the South, and now desire to have a government so organized as to put the institution of slavery beyond the reach of vote of the non-slave owner at the ballot box. But of course, the war came on. Johnson became military governor of Tennessee. And as military governor, he concentrated mostly on the war effort. But there are occasional pro-emancipation moves that he made, even in the early days of his governorship. For example, he had fortifications built around Nashville. And the slaves that labored on these fortifications were given their freedom, even if they were owned by unionist slaveholders. Greeneville was occupied by the Confederates for most of the Civil War. You had a really odd situation in Tennessee where East Tennessee was unionist in sentiment, but it was occupied by the Confederates for most of the war. Middle of January 1864 speech. Out of old slaves, he told the crowd, they were confiscated and sold. Yet 2 of them ran away from the rebel dominions and came here to me. I hired them, made a bargain with them for their labor, and thus recognized their freedom. And I find they do better than when they were slaves. Now, if any of you are slave owners, I advise you to go and do likewise. While you have a chance, hire laborers to work for you, and you will find that they will do better labor for you than when they were slaves. Will Johnson in his interview with Ernie Powell recalled the actual act of emancipation this way. One day Miss Johnson called us all in and said we were free now. She said we were free to go or we could stay if we wanted. We all stayed. That again shows you the closeness of the family. I think you have to say it was really not a massive slave. Unfortunately, there are some missing facts. Neither Will nor Andrew Johnson made a public statement identifying Paul's belief that this is the day of this Emancipation Act. But I suspect, and this is conjecture, but I suspect that Johnson at this time told someone, probably Sam because of his closeness, that this is just the beginning. This is the promise that I was talking about at the beginning of the speech. The promise of emancipation. And the reason I suspect this is a mere 3 weeks later, on August 29, 1863, Johnson did make a public statement about emancipation. The occasion was a belief by the Nashville people that Fort Sumter had fallen on the federal. It turned out that was not true. But they believed it, and they came to the Johnson house and asked him for a speech. He came out and made an impromptu speech. And among the things he said was this: the heart of the masses of the people beat strongly for freedom, that the system of Negro slavery has proved baleful to the nation by arraying itself against the institutions and interests of the people, and that time had clearly come when means should be devised for its total eradication from Tennessee. He said later in the speech that he was for immediate emancipation, but he would take gradual emancipation, whatever he could get, but he was for emancipation at all hands. Now, this is really important. August 1863 was before Abraham Lincoln had come out for immediate emancipation, so Johnson was the head of his own administration. In various speeches in 1864, Johnson urged the slaveholders of Tennessee to free their slaves immediately and not wait for the processes of government. In October 1864, Johnson, as military governor, proclaimed freedom for the slaves of Tennessee in a speech that's come to be called Moses of Freedom speech. It was not called that by Johnson. In February 1865, Johnson was a leader in the Tennessee Constitutional Convention, which abolished slavery in Tennessee. He, of course, became president on the assassination of Lincoln, and as president, he made ratification of the 13th Amendment ending slavery in America a high priority. He urged the ex-Confederate states to ratify, and all but Mississippi did so. In December 1865, ratification was completed by the votes of the legislatures of Georgia and Alabama, and the sum of all villainies was ended in our country. Mississippi ratified the 13th Amendment recently in the last couple of decades. Better late than never. But we shouldn't scoff because Tennessee has yet to ratify the 15th Amendment, removing race from the status from voting qualification. An oversight that I hope the legislature will correct. After Johnson became president, Sam wrote him a letter on March 25th, 1867 from Greeneville asking if he would sell a plot of land, quote, west of town, close to the rebel graveyard, unquote. The land was to be used for a school, quote, for the education of the colored children of Greeneville. The site of this school and church, which became the A&E Zion Church, is, we discovered it recently, slightly uphill from a street called Nancy Lane, N-A-N-C-I. And Nancy Lane, unfortunately, is difficult to find because the trees that come down and go over the sign. But the way you can find it is you're coming up West Main Street, just past McKee Hill, McKee Street. There's that big turn there at the funeral home. Then you pass on the right a street called Union Street. The next street up is Nancy Lane. And it's the one where you can't see the street sign of the trees. Nancy Lane was once called Graveyard Street. So it was the location of a real graveyard. And there's a little plateau just uphill, just west of Nancy Lane, where the church was located. Johnson offered the land. The Freedman School in Greeneville hesitated to start the school until the land was held with a clear title. And in September 1867, Johnson deeded without cost to, quote, Samuel Johnson et al. 1 acre of land for a church and schoolhouse. As I say, the church became the AME Zion Church, and it lasted into the 20th century in that location. At the end of this letter of Sam Johnson's asking him for this land, Sam Johnson said the following: I'm getting along very well. He said, I'm getting along as well as usual, and have not changed any in politics being for you as much as ever. I would like to see you all very much. This is 1867, the height of Johnson's conflict with the radicals of Congress, and Sam Johnson, his ex-slave, is saying, I have not changed any in politics being for you as much as ever. That same summer of 1867, Andrew Johnson began the effort to bring Frederick Douglass into the government. Douglass, of course, was the major black leader of the age. Johnson wanted him to head the Freedmen's Bureau. On July 17th, a White House representative inquired of Charles Douglass, Frederick's son, if his father, Frederick, who was out of town, would serve as head of the Freedmen's Bureau. Charles replied that he hoped his father would, and wrote him a letter describing the approach. The next week, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Wells wrote this about Johnson. The President asked again what I thought of putting Fred Douglass at the head of the Freedmen's Bureau instead of Howard. This is a reference to General Oliver Howard, who was then head of the Freedmen's Bureau. The problem with Oliver Howard was he didn't keep the books very well, and money was floating in, and no one knew where it was. A direct approach to Frederick Douglass was made on July 29th by William Slade, who was a black man employed at the White House, and who also became fairly close friend of Johnson. Later, when William Slade was dying, Johnson went to his bedside and sat up with him all night. William Slade wrote to Frederick Douglass offering the position, and Douglass, the letter was written on on a letterhead. The letterhead was Executive Mansion, Washington, D.C. So it was an official approach. Douglass responded, I duly estimate the importance of the office that you and your good kindness will procure for me. You would furnish me with instrumentalities and opportunities which I do not doubt I should have the heart and head to employ greatly to the advantage of our newly emancipated people, especially if I should be assisted, as I undoubtedly should be, by President Johnson if appointed by him. Nevertheless, my dear sir, without pronouncing at all upon the character and fitness of the present incumbent for the Bureau, with my present views of duty, I could not accept that office if it were tendered to me. Now there is you a road not taken. If Douglass had taken the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, we might have been quite a bit further along. Why did he not take the bureau? He wrote in a letter that September that he didn't want to facilitate the removal of a man as just and good as General Howard, and especially he didn't want to place himself under any obligation to keep the peace with Andrew Johnson. Douglass didn't like Johnson for a number of reasons, which we can go into in the discussion if you want to about it. I think the essential fact is not that Douglass refused, but that Johnson offered. So what did Johnson expect to get out of this? There's only one possibility. That's equal voting rights for blacks and whites. And Johnson specifically endorsed equal voting rights in a newspaper interview a few weeks later, this is August 22nd. So the interviewer asked Johnson, what are your views on the proper execution of the Reconstruction Acts? Now let me fill in what the Reconstruction Acts were first. They put the South, the ex-Confederate States, under military government, and they enfranchised the black and disfranchised any whites that were ex-Confederate soldiers. Now, a few ex-Confederate soldiers retained the vote. It was in the hands of the military governor of each district, but hundreds of thousands of whites were disenfranchised by that. So the reporter asked him, how would you enforce the Reconstruction Act? Johnson, quote, this was from the newspaper, answered that he could express his views in a few words. He desired fair registration of all qualified voters without regard for race or color. He did not wish to give any advantage to the white men, but much less was he disposed to make them slaves to the Negroes. Where the Negroes had the majority, as in South Carolina, he wished them to exercise the power. Where the white vote was in the majority, as in Texas, he desired that white majority to control. He wanted only the law to be fairly executed with equal chances for all. So, by 1867, Johnson was advocating equal rights. He'd come a long way on equal rights, but it was not just talk. After he survived the impeachment trial in 1867, there was a presidential election, and it came under the Reconstruction Act. So Secretary of War, by then it was John Schofield, had the duty of overseeing the election in the southern states. Schofield later wrote with President Johnson that he had acquiesced, this is quote, acquiesced without objection to all the measures I deemed necessary to preserve the peace and to secure a fair vote of the newly enfranchised citizens of the southern states in the presidential election. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans voted in the election of 1868, and the majority grant is within the numbers of African Americans who voted. Now, if you know Andrew Johnson, you know if he had opposed this, he would have fought. He would have been fighting, knowing he would probably lose, but that wouldn't stop Andrew Johnson from fighting. So he not only spoke in favor of equal voting rights, his actions support that. He returned home to Greeneville in East Tennessee after the presidency, and his association with the August the 8th celebration began fairly soon. There's an Knoxville Chronicle article, August the 9th, 1871, and one really wishes for a sound recording of this August the 8th meeting. It describes a parade from Greeneville to Tuscaloosa, in which Sam Johnson was the officer of the day. It describes the Greeneville brass band and a four-horse wagon, suitably bedecked with flags. Citizens in wagons, buggies, carriages, on horseback and on foot. It says the colored Sabbath school of the city. Most of the children were formed in procession carrying the American flag in front. They had a meeting at Tuscaloosa College from among people. And it did have an effect. There's a Knoxville Bulletin newspaper. This was a black-owned newspaper edited by Mr. W.F. Yardley. You probably recall Mr. Yardley as being one of the, I think he's the only black that ever ran for governor in the Tennessee. He was a newspaper editor, and in his newspaper it says that the juries in Knox County began to be integrated in 1882. So the group did have some effect. So with this history, I think we can see that the 8th August ceremony is a part of Tennessee tradition and East Tennessee tradition for racial pluralism that goes all the way back to the pioneer days, with Sam Doak, John Rankin, and many others, through the attempt to achieve emancipation without law. For example, the Constitutional Convention in the 1830s, when East Tennessee delegates tried to get Tennessee made a free state. Into the 1840s, the political career of Andrew Johnson, which I summarized, and the movement in the 1870s and 1880s to integrate the juries. In modern times, this tradition has continued. The first Southern school system integrated in the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s were in East Tennessee. That's Oak Ridge and Clinton High. So the effort to reclaim the 8th of August celebration, which is the basis of our meeting today, gives solid evidence that this noble and venerable tradition is still alive and well.
This is a certificate of appreciation, it says, Barbara Sunshine.
Good to see you.
Hey, Mama. How's my dog cowgirl doing? She really freaked out. She's maybe called